my honor and privilege to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I absolutely love that James Baldwin quote. And it makes me think a lot about this idea that history lives in each of us. We all descend from somebody that made a difference, somebody that may have given up their lives just for the freedoms that we do have in this country today, may have given up their lives just so that some of us can sit in a classroom together and get an education. So that will be one of the themes that I'll hammer on as I move forward through my presentation. So again, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this. You know, as you introduced me, Michael, I think I heard you say that I am the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know a grandparent, and some of you watching this may have even known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 101 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. Now, she didn't know that she was going to grow up and marry his grandson, Joseph, but that's what happened. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, she lived to be 94, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting at the knee of my great-grandmother, Fanny, as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting at the knee of my Aunt Portia, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And when we started our work in 2007 at the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, we immediately turned to schools. And I remember being in a class with fourth, fifth, and sixth graders, and they were all looking at me kind of cross-eyed, like, man, you are so far removed. And what does all of this history have to do with our lives today? And why are you talking about these people that lived so long ago? And so I wanted to try and help give the students some context to help them wrap their minds around the distance between the generations. And I had this thought that I think was kind of profound, that hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touch the great Booker T. Washington also touch mine. So, in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say that I stand one person away from each man. I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country, especially when you consider the distance between the generations. And so I'm going to talk to you about my ancestors just to kind of lay the groundwork and the foundation of the educational work that we do at our organization, because both of my ancestors were born into slavery. They were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education. Now, we know it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write, so both of my ancestors would have to steal their education. And for Frederick Douglass, who never spent one day of his life in the classroom, he was a self-taught scholar, and people would see this white-haired statesman near the end of his life, and they would want to know, Frederick, you know, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education? And the man who was the first African-American nominated for vice president of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, and the first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor, and so many other things. And they'd want to know, where did you go to school? And he would respond on occasion by saying, my diploma is written on my back. My diploma is written on my back. And so the education that my ancestors understood, that education equals emancipation, education equals freedom, education equals liberation, is at the foundation of the work that we do at Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. But before I jump into all of that, I thought I would just address a couple of questions that I typically get when people meet me for the first time. And one of those questions is, so wait a minute, so you're related to Frederick Douglass and to Booker T. Washington? Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. And so the other question, and so as you can imagine, there is this kind of weight of expectation and pressure that I've carried on my shoulders most of my life, and trying to step out of the long, vast shadows of these two great American heroes has not always been an easy task and an easy journey. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I move forward. Now, the other question that I get is, so I know Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington are not related to each other. So how is it you're related to both of them? And so I decided, I thought I was going to bring a few family photographs so that you can see the connection and how the two families came together. And so it happened on my mother's side. Everything is on my maternal side. My mother's mother, Nettie Hancock Washington, who you see on the screen here, was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. And my mother's father, who is on the left of the screen, Frederick Douglass III, was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. And so my grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee Institute, which is a school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881 at the age of 25. They happened to be on campus the same day. My grandmother had been born in the hospital on campus, but she was actually living in California at the time. She was just home for summer vacation. My grandfather was a surgeon, and he had been commissioned down to Tuskegee by the Veterans Administration during World War II. And so he decided this one evening that he was going to eat in the student cafeteria where he had never eaten before. And my grandmother was on campus to meet friends. And so if you can get this visual of my grandmother rushing across campus to meet friends and my grandfather strolling, and they literally bumped into each other, didn't know that the other descended from an historic family. And they fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married just 3 months later. And so perhaps it was a union that was meant to be. And when my mother was born, Nettie Washington Douglass, and my mother co-founded the organization with me, and she lives in Augusta, Georgia. She was the first person, my mother, to unite the bloodlines of these historic families. She was an only child, so I have the honor and privilege of being the first male in the family to carry the dual lineage. And so that's how the families came together. Also in this photograph is my grandmother's brother, Booker T. Washington III, on the right of the screen. And so the significance of this photo is you have Frederick Douglass III shaking hands with Booker T. Washington III, and then thus the families are officially united. I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. I am just as proud of her and her contributions to our country, to our family, as I am of Frederick. She was the first person, really, or one of the first people to put the seed of thought in his mind that he was not meant to be a slave for life. She was the first person in her family to be born free, and she lived in Baltimore. She was a domestic servant. Frederick Douglass, or Frederick Bailey, I should say, who was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on the eastern shore of Maryland, to an enslaved woman and to a white man. It was presumed that his enslaver was his father. And at this time, he was enslaved in Baltimore. So they met at some point, and as they started to think about a future together and perhaps having a family, she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. And had she not sold her personal belongings to help finance his escape, had she not put together the sailor's disguise that he would wear, who knows if he would have had the courage or the wherewithal to run away. And had that not happened, we would be a very different country sitting here today without the contributions of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist and all of the other things that I mentioned when I started. Anna was a radical freedom fighter in her own right. They were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together and 21 grandchildren. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad out of their house in Rochester, New York, where she helped to ferry hundreds of freedom seekers to their freedom in Canada. And so she is a really important person in the story. And we spend a lot of time, especially with young people, teaching and talking about her to lift up her life and legacy, because we want to make sure that our young women and our young girls are inspired and can see themselves in this history and this story as well. And then, of course, you've got Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist there. Booker T. Washington My great-great-grandfather, I don't have time to go into his story, but I wanted to mention him because of the educational component and his understanding that when he started Tuskegee, that he needed to provide an educational or build an educational institution that would help to educate some of those formerly enslaved people that were freed after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And then, of course, the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. And my great-great-grandmother, Olivia Davidson, had a lot to do with helping Booker T to build Tuskegee, which is now Tuskegee University, and his legacy of education continues on. Now, I wanted to show you this photograph. I love this picture. This is the only photograph of Frederick Douglass with his grandchildren. And as I mentioned, he and Anna had 21 grandchildren. And we like to say in our line that Joseph was the favorite grandchild. And so Joseph is my great grandfather. And so you see him with his grandfather in this photograph, which is taken toward the end of Frederick Douglass's life. Frederick, we know, taught himself to read. He taught himself to write, but not many people know that he was also a self-taught musician. He taught himself how to play the violin. He was a great teacher. He taught Joseph how to play the violin. Joseph would go on to be a concert violinist, playing in the White House at least on 3 occasions and traveling around the world. He was the first Black classical recording artist for the Victor Talking Machine Company. And so Frederick was a great teacher as well, on top of all of the other things that he accomplished. And in this next photograph, you see Joseph as an older man with my great-grandmother Fanny, who I mentioned lived to be 101 years old. And on her lap is my grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, and then his sister, Blanche. And what I wanted to do with these photographs, so you saw Joseph with his grandfather, now you see Joseph with Fanny, and in the next photograph, you may recognize somebody here, and that is me with the big afro. I was about 16 years old with my brother, Douglas Washington Morris, and then my great-grandmother, Fanny. And I love showing these photographs to young people when I first start talking about my family connection, because it helps to give them a visual and to see in just 3 photographs, in those 3 photographs, the connection that I have directly back to Frederick Douglass. So let me stop sharing my screen here. So as I mentioned, Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was born to an enslaved woman and to a white man. It was presumed that his enslaver was his father. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 6 or 7 years old. He only saw his mother on 4 occasions. That's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields, picking cotton from sunup to sundown, walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and then spend just a few precious moments with him until he would fall asleep. He was about a year old when he had been separated from his mother, and then she would have to walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face punishment. But he did have someone early in his life that showed him some love and nurturing and care, and that was his grandmother, Betsy. Now, her job on the plantation was to raise the children until they were really old enough to begin their life in manual labor. And on this plantation, that was around 5 or 6 years old. And so when Frederick was around that age, she said, "We're going to go on a long journey." And that journey was a 12-mile walk to the main plantation, to the great house, the big house. And if you can imagine, that walk took a long time, and she would carry Frederick much of the way when his legs couldn't carry himself, and he is nervous and scared. And they would finally get to the plantation home, and he would wander off to check out his surroundings and to look for something to eat. And when he turns back to look for his grandmother, she's gone. And so you have this little boy who had no family, he had no home, he had no country. He truly was an orphan, but in spite of all of that, he was able to rise up to go on to affect change in the world around him, and then to affect change for all of us. Now, again, when we talk with young people and we want them to be inspired by his legacy, we point to a story that he wrote about in his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself, which was first published in 1845. And in that book, he wrote, "I was always so hungry as a slave child, I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when I would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a trough similar to what animals or pigs would eat out of. And Frederick, along with the other children, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to eat what little food was in there, to eat like animals, because that's what he was. He was property. He did not own himself. And then also in that narrative, he talks about his time in Baltimore, where he had been chosen from among all of the children on the eastern shore of Maryland to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his enslaver's family. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't around people that could teach him to read and write, but now he was going to be in the big city. He would be around free Black children. He would be around poor white children. But what happened most importantly, when he got there, his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before, didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. And so she began to teach young Frederick his ABCs. And that was all he needed, was that little spark of light into his mental darkness. And the lessons would continue for a little while until his enslaver, his master, found out about them, the lessons, Hewald. And when he did, he got angry. And he looked at his wife and he looked at young Frederick Bailey, and he said, as Frederick remembers or recalls, he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." And Frederick heard that message loud and clear. And he understood right then and there that that was going to be his pathway to freedom. And he would teach himself to read and write. Now, again, I don't have time to go through the whole story, but I'll jump ahead and say that at the age of 18, he would make his first attempt to escape slavery. And he was caught. He was thrown in jail for a couple of weeks, and then he was sent back to Baltimore. And then again, with the help of my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna, he would escape by train and then by boat and land in New York City. He would write a letter back to Anna. She would come and join him. They would get married and take on the name Frederick and Anna Johnson to make it harder for his enslaver to be able to track him down. And then with the help of conductors on the Underground Railroad, it was suggested that they go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Frederick might be able to get work because he had acquired a skill as a ship caulker while working on the ship docks in Baltimore. And so they would travel to New Bedford and arrive 2 weeks later, change their name to Frederick and Anna Douglass, and then they would start to begin to have their family. And then jumping ahead from there, but before I jump ahead, let me just say I am so proud of my ancestors, especially at this time, because they could have just landed in New Bedford, and while Frederick was not legally free, he was still what we would have called a fugitive slave at that time. We call those people freedom seekers now. They could have just started a family and went on about their business, but they weren't happy as long as their brethren were still toiling away in chains and their family members were still enslaved. They were going to work to make sure that one day we would see the emancipation of slavery. Frederick would attend an anti-slavery meeting on Nantucket Island. He would stand up and just begin to tell his story to the people that were in attendance that day. The Garrisonians and William Lloyd Garrison invited him to be a paid lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, and he would go around from town to town, city to city, just telling his story. And the importance of what he was doing at that time was he was a survivor of the institution of slavery who could stand up. He was eloquent, he was charismatic, he was theatrical, he was even funny in some of the descriptions and the characters that he came into contact while he was enslaved. But what he was doing was really for the first time communicating the inhumanity of slavery to an audience in the way that nobody before him had ever done. And this would begin to push the abolitionist movement forward. But then he started to have a problem. People started to doubt that he had ever been enslaved. They couldn't wrap their minds around what they thought a slave looked and sounded like and what they were seeing in Frederick Douglass. So they started to call him a fraud. In order to prove he was who he claimed to be, he wrote that autobiography, the narrative that I mentioned earlier. And then he had another problem. When it was published in 1845, it became a bestseller. And that's the last thing that you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your enslaver, because it made him a household name, made him a celebrity. And so he would have to flee to Europe for a couple of years, and he would travel around speaking about the abolition of slavery in England and Ireland and Scotland. And then he would land in this place called Newcastle upon Tyne in England. And with the help of his supporters there, they were able to raise enough money to purchase his freedom for $711 from his enslaver. And then he was able to come back eventually to the United States as a free man. He would move the family to Rochester, New York, where he would begin to publish the North Star newspaper, which became the leading abolitionist voice. He would go on to be an advisor to President Lincoln during the Civil War, and then go on to statesman status and all of the things that I mentioned when I first started. So that's just kind of a quick overview of Frederick Douglass's life. And as I move forward, I just want to tell you that there was never a time where somebody sat me down and said, you know, we've got something really important to tell you about your ancestry. I just always knew. I spent all of my summers in Frederick Douglass's summer beach house in a place called Highland Beach, Maryland, which was built on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay. And Highland Beach was founded by my great-great-grandfather, Charles, who was Frederick and Anna's youngest son. And he built a retirement home for his father. And he asked his dad, are there any special features that you want in the home? And Frederick said, yes, I want it to sit right on the water. I want you to point it in a certain direction, and then build a tower at the top. And what he wanted to do at the end of his life was to sit up in that tower, look back across the water, back across the Chesapeake Bay, because on the other side, you could see land. And that land is the eastern shore of Maryland, where he had been born into slavery and where he had toiled away in chains. And even though he had suffered the inhumanity and the brutality and the exploitation of being enslaved for 20 years, he never wanted to forget where he came from. And going back to the James Baldwin quote that Michael started with, he understood that we need to know where we come from in order to know where we're headed, and that history lives in each of us. History is not just about the past, but it's about the present and it's about the future. And the more that we know where we come from, and especially for young people, understanding that greatness flows through their veins as well, the more that they know where they come from, they can better navigate the world in which they live, and they can move forward to the future. And so I am very proud of my ancestor, and I spent all of my summers in that summer beach home, and there were images of my ancestors in every room. And I remember one evening, I was about 5 years old, and there was this larger than life portrait of Frederick Douglass at the top of the stairs. And we all know the visuals of Frederick Douglass, the younger abolitionist, the fiery, steely gaze with which he looked into the camera when he said, I never want to look like a happy, amiable fugitive slave. And when you look me in the eye, you're going to see that I'm a man. You're going to see my humanity, and you'll see that I'm worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship. He became the most photographed American of the 19th century because he understood that he could use this new technology that he would come of age with, photography, to help make his arguments for liberation and equality, in addition to his oratory and his writings. So as a young boy, I didn't understand any of that stuff. And I just remember looking at this portrait and thinking, man, you look mean. And I'm glad I didn't know you. And as I would try and tiptoe past the portrait, you know what would happen. His eyes would follow me. And by the time I got down to the end of the hallway, I could feel that steely glare burning like fire on the back of my neck. And I always imagined in my little boy imagination this booming baritone voice, which he was said to have had, bellowing down upon my tiny person. He would say to me in my mind, you will do great things, young man. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know about all that. That's a lot of pressure. The few times that I told people of my relationship when I was younger, nobody ever believed me. I never thought that it was a point worth arguing. And I also seen what the pressure had done to those that came before me. And to be honest, I didn't want anything to do with it. And so I spent most of my life interacting with people who never even knew of my relationship. And I went to high school and went to college and then started my own career. I had an advertising and marketing company for almost 20 years. I'm a father of 2 daughters. I will celebrate 40 years of marriage in May. And so I was good. That's it. Don't talk to me about this Douglass and Washington stuff. But all of that changed in 2005. I read a National Geographic magazine, and the cover story was 21st century slaves. And it was an article about human trafficking and modern day slavery existing all over the world including right here in the United States. And that article just shocked me. I had heard about sex trafficking in far off places, or at least I thought about it in far off places, but I wanted to learn more. And so I started reading as much as I could. And there was one night I was sitting in my living room and I was reading another article about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men almost every single day. And down the hallway, I could hear my daughters getting ready for bed. And my older daughter, Jenna, was 12. So she was the same age as this girl that I was reading about. My younger daughter, Nicole, was 9. And my mind just starts racing and I can't wrap my brain around what I'm reading and what I'm hearing down the hallway. And I remember thinking to myself, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into bed and not being forced into bed to serve as some sick individual. And when I walked down the hallway and I went into their room, I had this moment where I couldn't even look them in the eyes. And I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And it was almost immediately that I understood that I did have this platform that my ancestors had built through struggle and through sacrifice. And perhaps we could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this issue. And it was kind of that aha moment where I thought about, well, we've got Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist and his legacy on one side, and Booker T. Washington and his legacy as the great educator on the other side. Aha, abolition through education. How can we unfit communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive? And so my mother and I started the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives in 2007. We immediately turned to schools. We didn't have a very good plan, or we didn't have a plan at all, but we knew that we needed to be in front of students. And so we just started talking about the history of slavery in this country and talking about my ancestors and many other freedom fighters that fought and forged the way for us. And then we would transition and start talking about human rights issues and talking about labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We would do this in an age-appropriate manner. And then after we would do this for a little while and traveling from school to school, we had teachers and parents and mostly students come back to us and say, well, now that we know about, or we're learning about the history of slavery in this country, and we're making a connection to human trafficking today or modern day slavery, how can we become modern day abolitionists? How can we do what a Frederick Douglass did? And that is communicate the inhumanity of slavery to our schools and to our communities in an effort to raise awareness about it. So we developed a program called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. And the Power of One is civic engagement and service learning that students do in their communities. And we wanted to institutionalize what we were doing so that we could get into more schools. And so we created curricula around that theme. And then any teacher that was looking for an innovative service learning project could download our curricula for free. And then they would be off and running in the classroom, and they would develop service projects and report back to us. And so that program now has evolved into an online training program for educators and anybody in the community that comes into contact with students on how to recognize signs of human trafficking, what red flags to look out for. And then teachers can be certified to be able to teach age-appropriate curricula in the classroom. And so our program now is K through 12. And it's called Protect. It's in partnership with 2 California-based nonprofit organizations, and it is the most comprehensive human trafficking prevention education that exists in the world. And we're in several states, and we're expanding internationally. So I'm really proud of that and the legacy of my ancestors around education and understanding that education equals freedom. And from that, we've been able to jump off into other things like legislation. We were able to work on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was first enacted in 2000. It's a piece of legislation that guides how the federal government responds to human trafficking domestically and internationally, and it gets reauthorized every 4 years. And in 2018, which was Frederick Douglass's bicentennial year, we went to the lead legislator, Representative Chris Smith out of New Jersey, and we asked if he would name it for Frederick Douglass, which he agreed to do. And then we asked if we could help write primary prevention education language into the legislation, because at that time it was just really reactive. It was called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It And I felt that it was flawed because it only addressed what happens after the victimization occurs. You have organizations that come in and rescue, rehabilitate, and restore the victims and survivors. You have law enforcement comes in after the crime's committed, and they arrest and they prosecute. But there was no focus on preventing the victimization in the first place. So as well-meaning as all the organizations are and were doing this work, there was really kind of this cycle of exploitation that was happening, where victims were just being rescued and restored and rehabilitated. That's very costly on a community, not to mention the cost on that victim or that child who's had their childhood stolen away from them. It's very hard to get back to any semblance of wholeness after being traumatized in that way. And so if we can reduce the vulnerability to young people to being trafficked for labor and for sex, that's what our program does. And I'm very proud that to date, we have trained more than 70,000 teachers who in turn have educated more than 800,000 students. And so again, we're reducing the vulnerability from being to being victimized in the first place. That's our primary project. We have a lot of other projects that we work on, including a publishing imprint called Frederick Douglass Books. We partnered with Forefront Books and Simon & Schuster, and our first publication was a Douglass Family edition of that narrative that I've been talking about. And we put together a project called 1 Million Abolitionists, and we're working to give away 1 million copies of that book to young people all over the world. And so far, we've given away more than 100,000 copies. We're a long way from the million, but with the continued support from educational institutions, corporations, foundation grants, and individual donations, we will get to that million at some point. And there is a service learning or civic engagement curriculum that goes along with that as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and close here with that theme that I talked about, this idea that history lives in each of us. I remember when we first started, I was in a classroom and there was a 10-year-old girl who was raising her hand. She was in her chair and she was so excited to share something with me. And I called on her and she said, "Mr. Morris, I want you to know that I researched my family tree and I found that my great, 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 four greats grandmother was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write, and then she escaped and she became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist. And she knew exactly what that word meant. And she was very proud to share it with me. And so as she's just bouncing up and down in her chairs, she said, "So, Mr. Morris, do you know what all of this means?" And before I had a chance to respond, she said, "It means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do." And I will never forget that. We all have greatness flowing through our veins. We all stand on the shoulders of those that came before us. And I like to think about, future generations and what will our great, great, great grandchildren say about all of this, all of us in this moment in time, this political climate in which we find ourselves, and the divisiveness in the country, and the sexist, racist, xenophobic rhetoric that's out there. Will our descendants say that we're on the right side of history or on the wrong side of history? And fortunately, my ancestors, I'm proud to say, were on the right side of history. And so history lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that history forward. So with that, I thank you very much for attending today. It's been my honor to be able to share a little bit with you, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have about my family, the work we do, what we're doing as we move forward. We have a lot of projects and initiatives that we are working on and really excited about. So thank you very much.